thank you for having me. Thank you, Dick. Thank you, Asia Society. And, well, I don't want to bore you about the Institute. I can say a couple of words. The Institute actually was created here in Los Angeles almost 10 years ago. And it was created out of the time I spent with some professors from USC and UCLA thinking about political governance, political systems, and the philosophies behind them. And from the beginning, I was very intrigued by what we've done in the West. I grew up in Europe. I grew up in Paris. Then I lived in London and then in New York for a long time. So I understood something about how the West, in terms of culture, in terms of policies, was functioning. But I became more and more interested in the East. And frankly, I have to credit this to the professors I spent time with at USC and UCLA. So out of my time with these great intellectuals that I found here in Los Angeles, I started to spend much more of my energy trying to understand what's happening on the other side of the world, meaning China and everything around, meaning Asia in general. And from this work and from the fact that I felt that the world was getting smaller at that time anyway, in terms of coming together, in terms of sort of global issues and global projects, I felt that it would be interesting to start an effort that could address long-term issues in an independent way, non-partisan way, and that's why the Institute was created, and do it also across cultures. So as opposed to others who have a cultural standpoint, we've taken almost the opposite attitude of saying we'll respect different practices and cultures for what they are and see if we can learn from them and then try to address the issues. And we've got 4 big themes: democracy, capitalism, geopolitics, and the future of the human. Who are we becoming in the age of gene editing and AI? Who do we want to be as humans? It's the first time we can, in essence, self-transform. So these are the big themes, but as opposed to treating them entirely from a Western standpoint, from the beginning, we felt we should look at all these issues, not just from a Western standpoint, but also from an Eastern standpoint. So today we have 2 centers, one in Los Angeles and the other one on the other side of the world in Beijing, on purpose, at a time when those 2 are not easily coupled. But we think maybe it's more important than ever today to at least try to have an understanding between very opposite cultures, because in a world that's frankly one, if you don't have some understanding between cultures, it'll be very hard to build a future for all of us on the planet. So that's, in a few words, a little bit of background.
Okay, just a thought about this is it's far away, and people that grew up in Europe would say that China and Japan are in the Far East. Now, I don't know if growing up in France you had that, but certainly the British did. And I like to think of Japan and China, California, being California's near west. And of course it is to the west for us, but becomes nearer and nearer every year because of telecommunications, but most importantly because of student flow and professorial flow. The flow of our people going back and forth and learning from each other and building families and building businesses is just terrific. Now, having said all that, Nicolas, why are the U.S. and China having problems?
So I think to your first point, one of the reasons why I personally am in LA is that it is Pacific facing. And I think that this century is the Pacific century. I grew up on the Atlantic. Atlantic is wonderful, great culture, but if you think about this century, it's, I think, the Pacific. So the entire West Coast, but also the other side, which is obviously Asia. That includes Japan and China and many others. So I think this is, for good or for bad, where the action is. And I think it's been for good, but your question about why today is there trouble is because it's been so good in some ways for the last 30 years that at some point there's a backlash. And the backlash, I think, happens because China's rise and the rise of everything that's around there, it started with Japan. If you remember, in the 80s, people thought that Japan was going to take over the world. And people were excited and then fearful of what happened in Japan. But Japan, didn't take over the world. The West and Japan found a way to work constructively. But then, in the shadow of Japan, China rose and became an extraordinary political, economic, and geopolitical power. The difference is that China is much bigger than Japan, and therefore the beneficial sides that we've benefited from in the West from China's rise suddenly looked like, from being sort of a win-win for the West and for China, people in the West have become fearful of China's rise and might. And it's not a surprise. I don't think it's just economic, but obviously it's political and cultural. We in the West have a certain way of thinking of our culture, political practices, and it's very hard for us to accept that someone on the other side of the world has different practices and a different culture that's legitimate, at least for itself. And it's almost, I feel, it's almost religious. We come in the West from very monotheist cultures where you have one idea of the truth, and the concept that you may have another version of the truth, meaning another political system, another culture, is very hard to accept. And China, frankly, represents a different way of running itself and a totally different concept of society. Not one that we would want to adopt, but one that at some point we'll have to accept or not, at least in terms of existence. Not for ourselves, but for itself. And today I think that's the bridge that we're having a great difficulty crossing. And the economic fight, I think, is the excuse for something much deeper, which I think was going to happen sooner or later, which is a clash of civilization. I just think that the present administration in Washington has precipitated...
A clash intellectually or a clash militarily?
Intellectually, hopefully never militarily, because that would be, potentially the end. But culturally, yes. And I think the present administration has precipitated the speed at which this clash is occurring by, starting the trade war. So that's the way I see things today. So the question is, where do we go from here?
Well, if the clash is cultural, if it's mental, it's much harder to cooperate on things than if it's just a matter of what's the tariff rate or the subsidy rate or the intellectual property theft. And yet you're optimistic that we can, in a positive nationalism idea, cooperate on some of the bigger problems. So would you expand a bit?
Well, I feel that to have a world that's safe, prosperous, productive, we have to be optimistic, meaning we have to find solutions. In this case, if we don't find solutions, it'll be extremely bad. From a practical standpoint and from, let's say, looking at all the positives, you could say that the last 30 years have been, as I said, a sort of a win-win for both the West and for China. economically, culturally. I would say generally everybody's benefited. If we simply have a trade war, ultimately both sides lose. But if the cultural war persists and it goes further than that, things that are important for the world to cooperate on, which are global issues like climate or health, are going to be very hard to address. So the world needs to cooperate. China is one of the key participants. Obviously, the U.S. and the West is a key participant. So you've got to be able to bring parties that may have different views and cultures together on certain things to have a future and prosperity. But from a safety standpoint, security standpoint, you also need cooperation. And there are certain things that are offensive, if you want, in a traditional, old-fashioned, way, which are weapons or so. But the weapons of the future are really quite different. They're AI and other technologies. And those are going to become more and more powerful and much harder to manage. So we need to cooperate on technology, which is going to be harder and harder. It's already hard. So I think we have no choice, if we want to have a peaceful world, than to find a way to at least respect each other in terms of cultures and existence, even if we don't want to adopt each other.
There's been talk in the White House about reducing or certainly slowing down the number of Chinese students coming to the United States. Do you think that could possibly happen in this political environment?
No doubt.
And the implications for that are to, of course, try to divorce these economies, divorce at least the technological sectors.
Well, the implications are a multitude, meaning you've had America has been very open in terms of students from everywhere, not just China. It's really everywhere. And I think it's had enormous benefits because all these students who come to America become, in some ways, American. So all the values of America, the strength of America, which I think is soft power, has been, given to them, millions of them over the years. So when they go back, they bring these values, they bring what they've learned to the world. So I think that's been very beneficial. America has also benefited from lots of talent, young people coming in here. So I think that and they pay, which is important, I think, in terms of supporting, the American educational institutions, which are among the best in the world. So it's been beneficial. If you slow down the students that come here and learn, you slow down cultural bridges, also economic bridges. The argument from an American standpoint is, well, these people come here, they don't stay here, they learn everything, they bring back what they've learned in America to their home countries. It benefits the home countries. Some of them are becoming spies. So you can turn all the positives into negatives. But at the end of the day, if you build fortresses, if you build walls, the ones who get hurt the most are the ones who isolate themselves. Frankly, that's what happened in some of the with some of the countries in Asia a century and a half ago.
Well, it's what happened when China launched its Cultural Revolution. It built walls around itself and cut itself off from the world. Let me go to one point you made, and then we're going to open it up to the audience to engage us. But you talked about the win-win of the globalization, and in particular the growth of China in the world economy. Of course, the Chinese export surplus to us has allowed us to grossly overconsume. When the United States runs a current account deficit, we are consuming more than we're producing. And we're able to do that because the people that are selling to us are willing to take non-interest-bearing notes called dollars, which these are IOUs, in exchange for computers or in exchange for iPhones. And then they buy up stocks or bonds, and these are promises to pay in the future. Somehow this is not well understood. In your book, you mentioned this in a couple of places. But is that really a stable financial future for America to be borrowing from the world at the scale that it has been?
So, if you're the world reserve currency, you can sustain this for a long time.
As long as the world accepts our currency.
Basically, that's what's happened. So, as long as you can continue to print dollars and people accept them, it's actually incredibly beneficial to America. So, I would argue that the trade deficit with China has actually been trade deficit, not just with China, with pretty much all the others, has been to the benefit of America, U.S. consumers, because you get somebody else to work for you, they send you their goods, and you send them, as you say, IOUs. It's not a bad deal. As long as you don't have to pay it back and the world finances you, it's been to a great benefit, at least to the generation up to now. Is it very healthy in the long term? Maybe not, but it's been incredibly beneficial. Other countries, after a while, are going to become larger and larger consumers, including China itself. So it may reverse over time. I wouldn't be surprised if it reverses in 10, 20 years, because a place like the U.S. is a great producer, a great consumer as well, but some of the countries in the East that are Far East, as you call it,
Near West,
or Near West, are becoming incredible consuming nations too. So I do think that after a period of time, it's going to begin to change. Now, some of these countries have been very protectionist, including China. So do they need to be more open in terms of letting competition in, letting foreign investors and foreign firms operate in their markets? Absolutely. So changes in practices are necessary. The question is, how do you achieve them? All right. Well, the idea is a very simple one. Positive nationalism is just, as opposed to just being against all others, just be for yourself. So, turn things around, act for yourself, but not necessarily against others. So it's a very different way of looking at things, as opposed to just fighting. You're fighting for yourself, but that doesn't mean that you're fighting against others.